Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Sandra sat up, running her fingers through her shoulder-length brown hair. It had grown so much in the past year, and she loved the way it framed her face. She glanced at the mirror across the room, taking in her reflection. The girl staring back at her still sometimes felt like a stranger, but a welcome one. Swinging her legs off the bed, she padded over to her closet. Her hand hovered over the array of clothes, dresses, skirts, blouses, all carefully chosen to reflect her true self. She settled on a pale blue sundress with white polka dots and slipped it on, relishing the feel of the soft fabric against her skin. As she applied her makeup, still a learning process but improving every day, Sandra's mind wandered to the appointment she had later that afternoon, another session with Dr. Patel, her therapist. These sessions had become a lifeline over the past months, helping her navigate the complex emotions that came with her transition. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts.
"Sandra, honey, breakfast is ready," her father's voice called out.
"Coming, Dad," she replied, giving herself one last look in the mirror before heading downstairs. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of pancakes and coffee. Her father stood at the stove, flipping the last pancake onto a stack. He turned, his face lighting up with a warm smile as he saw her. "Good morning, sweetheart. You look lovely today," he said, placing the plate of pancakes on the table. Sandra felt a rush of warmth. Her father's unwavering support had been her rock throughout this journey. "Thanks, Dad," she said, taking a seat at the table. As they ate, her father cleared his throat.
"So, you have your appointment with Dr. Patel today, right?"
Sandra nodded, swallowing a mouthful of pancake. "Yeah, at 3 p.m.
"Do you want me to drive you?"
he offered. She shook her head. "No, it's okay. Brian's picking me up. We're going to grab coffee after." Her father's eyebrows raised slightly at the mention of Brian's name.
"Brian? You two have been spending a lot of time together lately."
Sandra felt a blush creep up her cheeks. Brian had been her best friend since childhood, and lately their relationship had been evolving. "We're just friends, Dad," she said, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Her father gave her a knowing look but didn't push the subject. "All right. Well, have a good day. And remember, I'm here if you need to talk about anything." After breakfast, Sandra retreated to her room to prepare for her day. As she sat at her desk, her eyes fell on the small pill organizer. She popped open the compartment labeled Thursday and tipped 2 small blue pills into her hand. Her hormone therapy, another step in her journey. As she swallowed the pills with a sip of water, her phone buzzed with a text from Brian. "Hey, still good for today? Can't wait to see you." Sandra smiled, typing out a quick reply. "Definitely. See you at 2:30. The hours ticked by slowly as Sandra busied herself with chores and catching up on some reading. Finally, at 2:25, she heard a car horn outside. Grabbing her purse, she called out a goodbye to her father and stepped out into the warm afternoon sun. Brian was leaning against his beat-up Honda Civic, a grin spreading across his face as he saw her. "Hey, you," he said, pulling her into a hug. Sandra felt her heart skip a beat as she breathed in his familiar scent.
"Hey, yourself,"
she replied, pulling back to look at him. Brian's eyes roamed over her face, his expression softening. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. For a moment they stood there, caught in each other's gaze. Then Brian cleared his throat, breaking the spell.
"We should get going. Don't want you to be late for Dr. Patel."
The drive to the therapist's office was filled with easy chatter and laughter. Sandra found herself stealing glances at Brian as he drove, wondering if he felt the same electricity between them that she did. All too soon, they arrived at the office building. Brian put the car in park and turned to her. "I'll be right here when you're done, okay?" Sandra nodded, suddenly feeling nervous about the session ahead.
"Thanks, Brian, for everything."
He reached out and squeezed her hand.
"Always."
Taking a deep breath, Sandra stepped out of the car and made her way into the building. The elevator ride to the 5th floor seemed to take forever, her stomach churning with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Dr. Patel's office was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and comfortable furniture. The therapist herself, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, greeted Sandra with a gentle smile. "Hello, Sandra. How are you feeling today?" Sandra settled into the plush armchair across from Dr. Patel. "I'm okay, I think. A lot on my mind." Dr. Patel nodded encouragingly. "Why don't we start there? What's been occupying your thoughts?" Sandra took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "Well, I've been thinking a lot about my progress. It's been almost a year since I started transitioning, and sometimes I still can't believe how far I've come." "That's a significant milestone," Dr. Patel agreed. "How do you feel when you reflect on your journey so far?" "Proud, mostly," Sandra said, a small smile playing on her lips. "But also scared. Like, what if I'm not doing it right? What if I'm not woman enough?" Dr. Patel leaned forward slightly. "Sandra, remember what we've discussed about internalized transphobia? There's no one right way to be a woman. Your journey is unique to you." Sandra nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I know logically, but sometimes those doubts creep in, you know?" "That's perfectly normal," Dr. Patel assured her. "Let's explore those feelings a bit more. Can you give me an example of when you felt not woman enough?" Sandra thought for a moment. "Well, there's this girl in my English class, Emma. She's so effortlessly feminine. The way she talks, moves, everything. Sometimes I catch myself trying to imitate her, and then I feel ridiculous." Dr. Patel nodded understandingly. "It's common to look to others as models when we're trying to find our own way. But remember, Emma has had her whole life to develop her mannerisms and style. You're still discovering yours. It's okay to take inspiration from others, but don't forget that your unique experiences and personality are what make you, you." Sandra felt a weight lift from her chest at these words. "That actually helps a lot. Thank you." As the session continued, they delved into other aspects of Sandra's life, her relationship with her father, her progress in school, and her evolving friendship with Brian. "And how are things going with Brian?" Dr. Patel asked, a knowing glint in her eye. Sandra felt her cheeks grow warm. "They're good. Really good, actually. He's been so supportive throughout everything." "It sounds like he's an important person in your life," Dr. Patel observed. Sandra nodded, a soft smile playing on her lips. "He is. We've been friends forever, but lately, I don't know. Something feels different." Dr. Patel leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Different how?" "Well," Sandra began, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress, "we've always been close, but now there's this tension? Not in a bad way, but like electricity. Does that make sense?" Dr. Patel smiled warmly. "It makes perfect sense, Sandra. It sounds like your feelings for Brian might be evolving beyond friendship. How do you feel about that possibility?" Sandra's heart raced at the therapist's words. She'd been dancing around this realization for weeks, but hearing it stated so plainly made it feel more real. I think I like it," she admitted. "But it's also terrifying. What if he doesn't feel the same way? What if he only sees me as his childhood friend, not as a woman?" "Those are valid concerns," Dr. Patel acknowledged. "But remember, Sandra, you are a woman. Your identity isn't dependent on how others perceive you. Have you considered talking to Brian about your feelings?" Sandra shook her head vigorously. "No way! I couldn't risk ruining our friendship." "Keeping these feelings bottled up could also affect your friendship," Dr. Patel pointed out gently. "Communication is key in any relationship, romantic or otherwise. You don't have to declare your love, but perhaps you could test the waters, see how he responds to some subtle flirting." The idea made Sandra's palms sweat, but she had to admit it made sense. Maybe. I'll think about it. As their session drew to a close, Dr. Patel smiled at Sandra. You've made remarkable progress, Sandra. Remember to be kind to yourself and celebrate your journey. You're doing great. Sandra left the office feeling lighter, her mind buzzing with new perspectives and possibilities. As promised, Brian was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his car with a paper cup in each hand. Thought you might need a pick-me-up, he said, offering her one of the cups. Sandra took it gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma of her favorite latte. You're the best, you know that? Brian grinned, a slight blush coloring his cheeks. I try. So, how was your session? As they settled into the car, Sandra found herself opening up about her therapy session, leaving out the part about her feelings for Brian, of course. He listened attentively, offering words of encouragement and support. I'm really proud of you, Sandra, he said as they pulled into the parking lot of their favorite coffee shop. You've come so far, and you're so brave. Sandra felt a warmth bloom in her chest at his words. As they walked into the coffee shop, she made a split-second decision. Reaching out, she laced her fingers through Brian's, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. Brian looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Sandra, a mix of surprise and something else. Hope, maybe, in his eyes. He squeezed her hand back, a soft smile playing on his lips. They found a cozy corner booth and settled in, their hands reluctantly parting to pick up their menus. As they chatted and laughed over their coffees, Sandra felt a sense of contentment wash over her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she had the strength to face them, and people like Brian by her side. As the afternoon wore on, their conversation flowed easily from topic to topic. Sandra found herself studying Brian's face as he spoke animatedly about his latest programming project. The way his eyes lit up with passion, the quirk of his eyebrow when he was trying to explain a complex concept. She'd seen these expressions 1,000 times before, but now they seemed to hold new meaning. Earth to Sandra! Brian's voice broke through her reverie. You okay? You kind of zoned out there. Sandra blinked, realizing she'd been staring. Oh, sorry, I was just thinking. Brian tilted his head, a curious smile playing on his lips. Penny for your thoughts? For a moment, Sandra considered deflecting, but Dr. Patel's words echoed in her mind. Maybe it was time to test the waters. I was just thinking about how much I enjoy spending time with you, she said, her heart pounding. How grateful I am to have you in my life. Brian's expression softened, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I feel the same way, Sandra. You're really special to me. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words. Sandra found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by the warmth in Brian's gaze. For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her. But then the spell was broken by the shrill ring of Brian's phone. He jumped, fumbling to silence it. Sorry, it's my mom, he said, looking genuinely apologetic. I should take this. As Brian stepped outside to take the call, Sandra let out a long breath, her mind reeling. What had just happened? Were they really on the verge of something more? When Brian returned, there was a slight awkwardness between them, the moment lost. Sorry about that, he said, sliding back into the booth. My mom needs me to pick up my sister from her dance class. I hate to cut this short, but... No, it's fine, Sandra assured him, even as disappointment settled in her stomach. We should probably get going anyway. The drive back to Sandra's house was quieter than usual, both of them lost in thought. As Brian pulled up in front of her house, Sandra turned to him. Thanks for today, Brian. For the ride, the coffee, everything. Brian smiled, reaching out to squeeze her hand. Anytime, Sandra. You know I'm always here for you. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Sandra thought about leaning in, closing the distance between them. But fear held her back. What if she was misreading things? What if he didn't feel the same way? "I'll see you tomorrow," she said instead, her voice slightly higher than usual. Brian nodded, his smile warm.
"Definitely. Have a good night, Sandra."
As she watched Brian's car disappear down the street, Sandra felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Excitement, fear, hope, uncertainty. It was all tangled up in a confusing knot. She made her way inside, her mind replaying every moment of their afternoon together. Her father called out a greeting from the living room, but Sandra barely heard him, lost in her thoughts as she climbed the stairs to her room. Flopping onto her bed, Sandra stared at the ceiling, her heart still racing. She'd always known that transitioning would bring changes to her life, but she never expected this, these new, thrilling, terrifying feelings for her best friend. As she lay there, processing the events of the day, Sandra's phone buzzed with a text. Her heart leapt when she saw it was from Brian. "Had a great time today. Sweet dreams, beautiful." Sandra read and reread the message, her cheeks flushing at the word beautiful. Was this flirting? Or just Brian being his usual sweet self? With a groan, she buried her face in her pillow. One thing was clear, her journey of self-discovery was far from over. But as scary as it was, there was also excitement in the unknown. Who knew what tomorrow might bring? As the days passed, Sandra found herself hyper-aware of every interaction with Brian. The casual touches that had once felt so natural now sent sparks through her body. Their conversations, while still easy and comfortable, seemed charged with a new energy. At school, Sandra couldn't help but notice the curious glances and whispers that followed her and Brian as they walked down the hallways together. It wasn't anything new. There had always been talk about their close friendship, but now it felt different, more significant. One day, as they sat together at lunch, Emma from Sandra's English class approached their table. "Hey, Sandra," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "I was wondering if you'd like to join us for a girls' night this weekend? We're having a sleepover at my place." Sandra blinked in surprise. While her classmates had generally been accepting of her transition, this was the first time she'd been explicitly invited to a girls' event. "Oh, sure," she stammered. "That sounds fun." Emma beamed. "Great, I'll text you the details." She glanced at Brian, a knowing smirk on her face. "Sorry, Brian, girls only." As Emma sashayed away, Sandra turned to Brian, her eyes wide. "Did that really just happen?" Brian grinned, nudging her shoulder playfully. "Look at you, getting invited to the cool girls' slumber party. Should I be jealous?" Sandra rolled her eyes, but couldn't help the pleased smile that spread across her face. "As if you know you're still my favorite person to hang out with." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Sandra felt her cheeks grow warm. Brian's expression softened, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "You're my favorite person, too," he said quietly. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the bustling cafeteria fading into the background. Then the bell rang, startling them both. As they gathered their things and headed to class, Sandra's mind was whirling. The invitation to the sleepover, Brian's words, it all felt like steps forward in her journey, small validations of her identity and her place in the world. The rest of the week passed in a blur of classes, therapy sessions, and increasingly charged moments with Brian. Before Sandra knew it, Friday night had arrived, and she was standing on Emma's front porch, overnight bag in hand. Emma answered the door with a squeal of excitement. "Sandra, you made it!" She pulled Sandra into a hug, then ushered her inside. "Come on, everyone's in the basement." As they descended the stairs, Sandra's stomach churned with nerves. What if the other girls didn't really want her there? What if she didn't fit in? But her fears were quickly put to rest as she entered the basement. The room was filled with the chatter and laughter of a dozen girls, sprawled across couches and sleeping bags. They all looked up as Sandra entered, greeting her with warm smiles and enthusiastic hellos. "Sandra!" called out Jess, a girl from her history class. come sit with us. We're about to start painting nails." As Sandra settled into the group, she felt a wave of belonging wash over her. The girls chatted easily, sharing gossip and stories, including Sandra as if she'd always been part of their circle. They painted each other's nails, braided hair, and talked about everything from school drama to their latest crushes. "So, Sandra," Emma said with a mischievous grin as she applied a coat of sparkly polish to Sandra's nails. "What's the deal with you and Brian? Are you guys finally together?" Sandra felt her face heat up. "What? No, we're just friends." The other girls exchanged knowing looks. "Come on," Jess chimed in. "We've all seen the way he looks at you. That boy is totally smitten." "Really?" Sandra couldn't keep the hope out of her voice. "Absolutely," Emma nodded. "The question is, do you like him back?" Sandra bit her lip, considering her answer. These girls had welcomed her so openly, made her feel like one of them. Maybe it was okay to open up a little. I think I do," she admitted. "But I'm scared. What if it ruins our friendship?" The girls immediately launched into a chorus of advice and encouragement. As Sandra listened to their perspectives and shared more of her own feelings, she felt a sense of normalcy she'd never experienced before. This is what it was like to just be one of the girls, sharing secrets and supporting each other. As the night wore on, they watched rom-coms, ate too much junk food, and stayed up far too late talking and laughing. When Sandra finally crawled into her sleeping bag in the early hours of the morning, she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the sugar rush from the candy they'd consumed. She'd worried so much about fitting in, about being woman enough. But here, surrounded by the soft breathing of her sleeping friends, Sandra realized something important. There was no one way to be a woman. She was already enough, just as she was. The next morning, as the girls were packing up their things and saying their goodbyes, Emma pulled Sandra aside. "I'm really glad you came," she said sincerely. "And I want you to know, if anyone ever gives you a hard time, we've got your back." Sandra felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you," she said, pulling Emma into a hug. "That means more than you know." As Sandra's father picked her up from Emma's house, she couldn't stop smiling. "Looks like you had a good time," he observed, a pleased expression on his face. "The best," Sandra replied. "Dad, I think I'm finally starting to feel like I belong." Her father reached over to squeeze her hand. "I'm so happy for you, sweetheart. You deserve all the happiness in the world." When they arrived home, Sandra headed straight for her room, eager to text Brian about her night. But as she pulled out her phone, she saw she already had a message from him. "Hope you had fun at the sleepover. Can we talk? I'll be at our spot in the park at 3 if you want to meet." Sandra's heart raced as she read the message. Their spot in the park was where they always went when they had something important to discuss. What did Brian want to talk about? As 3 o'clock approached, Sandra found herself standing in front of her mirror, scrutinizing her reflection. She'd changed outfits 3 times before settling on a flowy floral dress and denim jacket. Her makeup was subtle but carefully applied, and she'd spent extra time styling her hair. Taking a deep breath, she headed out, her stomach a knot of nerves and excitement. The walk to the park seemed both too long and too short. Before she knew it, she was approaching the old oak tree where she and Brian had spent countless hours talking, laughing, and sharing secrets over the years. Brian was already there, pacing back and forth. When he saw her, he stopped, a smile spreading across his face. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey, yourself," Sandra replied, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, they just stood there looking at each other. Then Brian took a deep breath. "Sandra, I need to tell you something." Sandra's heart pounded in her chest. "Okay," she managed to say. Brian stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. About how much you mean to me." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Sandra, I think I'm falling in love with you." The world seemed to stop. Sandra stared at Brian, barely able to believe what she'd just heard. You... what? Brian reached out, taking her hands in his.
I love you, Sandra. Not just as my best friend, but as the amazing, beautiful, incredible woman you are. I understand if you don't feel the same way, or if you're not ready for this. But I needed you to know. Tears welled up in Sandra's eyes. All her fears, all her doubts about whether Brian could see her as a woman, whether he could love her for who she truly was, they all melted away in the face of his heartfelt declaration. "Brian," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "I love you too. I've been so scared to admit it, but I do. I love you so much." The smile that lit up Brian's face was brighter than the sun. Slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to, he leaned in. Their lips met in a soft, sweet kiss that sent tingles through Sandra's entire body. When they finally pulled apart, they were both grinning like fools. Brian rested his forehead against hers. "So," he said, a hint of playfulness in his voice, "does this mean you'll be my girlfriend?" Sandra laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'd love to be your girlfriend." Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.